Um, so I'll lean into the microphone here. I'm sitting talking with Professor Patricia Fagan from the University of Windsor. Professor Fagan is actually in the classics department, but she wrote this excellent book on Plato called Plato and Tradition, The Poetic and Cultural Context of Philosophy, a really nice book. And so I just wanted to talk with her about her orientation to Plato, especially because she comes from a classics department and she's a specialist in Homer. Uh, and so, Patricia, maybe I could start with that. What what leads a specialist in Homer to study Plato?
Um, I suppose in part, I think Plato and Homer stand out in ancient Greek texts as possibly the two greatest writers or composers. And so that's one thing. So there's just the importance of Plato for the history of thought in the West, and I guess Plato also had read his Homer and knew a lot about it and interprets the Homeric poems in his texts often and uses and relies on the familiarity that his earliest readers would have had with those poems and with the stories, and he incorporates all of that background into the work that he's doing in each of his dialogues. And so as a Homer person, Plato is interesting as an interpreter of these things that I find so compelling and important. And he shows ways in which the world that produced those Homeric poems, which is 300 or 400 years before Plato's lifetime, how aspects of that world are still alive and still vibrant, and but also how they've changed to continue to be meaningful.
Um, when you mention that, when you talk about Plato being so informed by and responsive to Homer, I wonder if you have anything to say about the Republic. You know, in Book 2 and especially Book 3 of the Republic, and I suppose also in Book 10, Plato talks a lot about poetry and its educational place in the city. And well, I shouldn't say Plato talks about it. Socrates talks about it with Glaucon and Adeimantus. And the general tone of their discussion is critical of aspects of that. And so people have often interpreted Plato's Republic as a kind of condemnation of that kind of poetry, and as advocating a kind of censorship. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that. And I also want to ask you, even though I just failed to do it, I want to ask you to try to lean into the microphone a
Okay.
bit and speak and speak really
Okay.
loudly.
Loudly. I myself do not believe that Plato condemns poetry and that Plato advocates keeping poetry out of education and out of the world. Two main reasons, I guess, that I think that. First, Plato never actually says anything in his own voice in any of the texts that we study. What he presents is dramas. It's people, characters in particular situations having conversations about things. And Socrates certainly is a kind of privileged speaker within those dialogues and has a kind of authority, but that doesn't mean he is Plato or that he speaks for Plato. So I would never, ever want to say Plato thinks. I would talk about what Plato does as a writer in the same way that I would talk about what Homer does or what Toni Morrison does or things like that. But I don't think we can say what Plato thinks.
Yeah. Go on.
I guess that was the first thing, wasn't it? And then secondly, if we look at what Plato does over and over and over and over and over again in his texts, what we see is he uses poetry. He has his characters quote poetry. He alludes to things. He uses myths. So all of that poetic and mythological material is part of that. It is the fabric of his writing and the fabric of the expression of his thought.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. So you said at one point, you wouldn't want to say what Plato thinks, but I wonder if you've gone a little too farther. In other words, I imagine you have taken something away from the reading of these things. So I wonder if you could say something about what you think, for lack of a better expression, Plato is saying, or what you think these dialogues do, or what you get from them, something like that.
okay, yeah. I typically overstate things. I'll just admit that up front, and you can be aware of that. What I get from Plato, what I think Plato thinks, what I take away from my experience of reading his texts is that he thinks that philosophy is something that people do together in conversation, and that the questions that philosophy asks, like the questions with which the Republic opens, what is justice, those are questions that every single person who is alive is involved in. That philosophical thinking, or just philosophical, what we would call, I guess, philosophical issues, aren't some separate intellectual academic thing. They are how people live, and they're about the fundamental situations and questions and dilemmas and experiences that we meet every day. So I'd say Plato puts philosophy into life, and I would say he thinks that's what you should be doing.
Yeah.
And I would say Plato thinks that it's important for philosophical work and intellectual work in general, political work maybe. This is all stuff that is most profitably done and most successfully done, or most meaningfully done maybe is the better word. Most meaningfully done when people do it together. That it's a group activity, and you can be better and worse at it,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. And so part of what I think we can take away from studying Plato is learning how to talk well with other people, and with all kinds of other people. Learning how to talk well with other people about things that are hard to think about, challenging because we maybe haven't thought about them before, or difficult because they touch us intimately. And so Plato provides, not explicitly and step by step, but more by example, paths for having a good conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and learning something from yourself and from other people.
Yep. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the significance of Plato's writing in the context of Greek literature or Greek history. I mean, I imagine these things were written sometime between 400 and 360 BC or something like that. And it seems to me they're pretty different from anything else straightforwardly that you would see in Greek writing before that, or probably any writing anywhere. You may disagree, but I wonder if you have anything to say about the historical and cultural significance of that in the context of ancient Greece? Or maybe you don't.
Maybe I don't. Let me just think. Well, I would say, just with regards to the point about these being unique kind of things, and I think that is largely true. People have noticed, and it's pretty. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's self-evident, because it's not that, but people do note strong similarities between what Plato does in his dialogues and what you would see in the Athenian dramatists of the 5th century, people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and Plato's pretty familiar with those guys, being an Athenian himself, and they're important poets, and there are lots of other poets doing drama that we don't have access to anymore. So the people have noted that the dialogues are little dramas in a way. Another thing that is interesting about Plato's writing is that his works are very sophisticated, rich, ambitious versions of a genre of literature that mostly is lost to us now, which is something we call the Socratic dialogue. After the death of Socrates, a lot of writers in Athens specifically, but a lot of writers started writing dialogues on philosophical questions in which Socrates was an important character, and we've still got a few dialogues written by a contemporary of Plato from Athens, a guy named Xenophon, who also wrote some histories of
And the
of
Politeia
Greece.
of the Spartans, which we read.
Yeah. So, so I think what is fascinating about Plato, just from a kind of genre and history of literature perspective, is the way in which he takes the stuff that's kind of a given in his world culturally, his predecessors, his colleagues, and creates these things that are, I think, maybe unique, not so much because of their form, but because of the amazing quality and subtlety of what he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned in there that Plato's writing, like other writings, pick up on, or draw on the character of Socrates and put him in drama, and that just reminds me of Socrates. We're in this class we're studying the Republic and the Apology, and I wonder if you have any things to say about the Apology, either your own interpretive orientation towards it or your sense of what Plato's Apology offers, or even anything you might have to say about the trial of Socrates.
Yeah. Socrates was a real guy. He lived and breathed and walked the streets of Athens. And in 399, he was put on trial on charges of introducing new gods and corrupting the youth of Athens, that was essentially a religious charge. And one of the possible penalties for it was execution. And as we know, the jury found him guilty and put him to death. And then voted to put him to death. One of the things I find, the Apology's pretty fabulous, and it's quite unusual in Plato's corpus as a text in which almost exclusively the only voice is the voice of Socrates. There's a little bit where he cross-examines one of his prosecutors, and so there's a back and forth, but it's Socrates talking, and there's two speeches. His speech that addresses the charges against him. Then there's a pause when the verdict is reached, and then in the Athenian jury courts, once a guilty verdict had been voted on, once someone was voted guilty by the jury, the prosecution and the defense debated again with counter proposals about the penalty that the now guilty guy would face. And then so we get the second speech, which is Socrates making his speech about what he thinks would be an appropriate penalty for himself. And we have quite a lot of texts of speeches from the Athenian jury courts. And the Apology is very interesting as a commentary on the jury courts. The jury courts of the Athenians under the democracy were nothing like what we do nowadays in North America. And one of the things that is, I guess two things that are particularly remarkable is that there were no professionals in the law in those courts. There were no judges that oversaw the courts. Socrates defended himself at his trial, not because he was some crazy, I'm going to represent myself person, but because that's what people did. It was a self-help system, they call it. Similarly with the prosecution. So that's one thing that's I think very important to know about those jury courts. And the second thing is the size of the jury in the Athenian courts was big. They ranged in size from 101 to usually 501 jurors. They tried always to have an odd number in case, and then the verdict was rendered by a simple majority vote. So you always wanted to make sure that you didn't have an even number of jurors, because then you would have 50-50 potentially, and that would not be good. And the jury courts for the Athenians, and this is especially true in the 4th century when Plato was actually writing, the jury courts for the Athenians were one of the clearest expressions of the working of the democracy. This is citizens in action, using the law, protecting each other through protecting the law, and doing the work of, on behalf of the city, listening to cases and voting. There was no deliberation, they just voted right away. And increasingly, the jury courts were becoming tools. And we see this, I think, possibly in the death of Socrates. 30 years earlier, if the Athenians had wanted to get rid of someone that they didn't like and they found pesky, they would have ostracized him. So they would have held a vote in the citizen assembly and they would have sent him away for 10 years. And then he could have come back. But by the time we get to the end of the Peloponnesian War and the 4th century, what they were doing instead was using religious charges to kill people. And so the jury courts had become a tool for politicians, basically, and political groups and all that kind of stuff. And Socrates addresses all of that stuff in his speech,
Yep.
in the Apology, and he addresses, I think, some of the issues involving the jury courts that troubled many Athenians, which is and I think a big one is the question of persuasion. And is persuasion arguing well and cogently to a conclusion that is something like true, or is persuasion getting people to support whatever it is that you're saying? And Socrates does not want to do that second thing.
Yeah.
And that's the medium of the jury courts, is the persuasion to win, not the persuasion to tell the truth. And so the jury courts become, in the Apology, an expression of Athenian democracy, but an expression of all of the things that are not working properly in the democracy.
Yeah, it's interesting. That last thing you say is interesting because some people, when they talk about the apology, say that what happens is that Socrates inverts the situation, and whereas officially he's on trial and being judged by the jurors, that what he's actually doing, can you move that cat? What he's actually doing is the jury is on trial, and he's actually essentially judging the jury on whether or not it's living up to its mandate, so to speak.
Yeah.
And do you have so that's very interesting. Do you have other things to say about the apology itself as a piece of Platonic writing? It's fine if you don't, but you were talking there more about the trial of Socrates in general. I just wonder if you have anything more to say about the apology or the Republic, for that matter, either of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, excuse me. I notice. I think most people who read the apology seriously and carefully and I guess with an open heart are struck by the candor with which Socrates explains why he spends his life doing the things that he does, and his commitment to doing philosophy, but more importantly, and maybe this isn't something that comes out in the other dialogues quite as much, but once Socrates explains in the Apology what he's doing, you think, yeah, that's been him all along. He does philosophy, because there's the story of the oracle, and he's going out to find out what on God's green earth does Apollo mean when he says that no one is wiser than Socrates, and so on and so forth. And it does seem like it's a pretty personal kind of thing, but he does tell us that I keep on doing this because when I started that task of finding out what could it mean to say no one is wiser than Socrates, I discovered that a lot of people have really wrong ideas about what their position with respect to knowledge and understanding is, and I think it's important that we all try to get better at that stuff, and that's what I'm doing, and that I'm a guy who's out talking in public, going to people's houses all the time on behalf of my fellow citizens, and he's very Athens oriented, but that philosophy is not for him something that he does because it puts him in any kind of special position with respect to knowledge and understanding. It's something that he does because he really believes that the world and other people are better off when we ask these questions and when we have these conversations together. And that seems like a very true thing. And it's really beautifully expressed in the Apology.
Yep. Well, that's really great, Patricia. Thank you for talking with me and with us, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.